Hey, folks, you're listening to the Jobs Podcast, and I am your host, Tim Hendricks. I'm not going to waste your time by babbling on endlessly. Let's go ahead and get right to the interview. Today, we've got Brent with us. Brent is a cancer research doctor. This guy is as smart as a tack. It's been my pleasure to know him for a number of decades, and he's going to tell us where he started, when his interest in science began, all the way to where he is now doing clinical trials for all kinds of cancer research. He's going to have to explain some of this stuff to me like I'm five, but he's a patient guy, so I think he'll do well. Hey, Brent, how you doing, man?
Hey Tim, I'm all right. It's Friday.
Oh, I know. Ready for the weekend?
Yes, very much.
Good deal. Well, let's get just started. We'll just start right out of the bat by going with your childhood story, the places that you've lived, where you were born, family, just, a general snapshot about who you are and where you've come from.
Yeah, I actually was able to live in a few different places. My dad worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service, so we kind of moved around a bit, but lived out in the country for a good chunk of my childhood. So that's been unique and fun. So I was born in Georgia, and then moved to North Dakota, and then South Texas along the Gulf Coast, and then the Panhandle of Oklahoma. All of those were pretty much in the country, and then when I was in the summer of seventh grade, between seventh and eighth grade, we moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico,
Hmm.
and finished high school there. That's kind of what I consider home. I like the Southwest and the mountains a lot. Um,
What did I'm assuming it was your dad. What did he do that caused you to move around so much?
well, he drank a lot, and they got fired.
Running from the law?
Yeah, a lot of packing in the middle of the night. I don't know. Um, we no, he worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service, so he was. Though a lot of people aren't as familiar with them, they think, oh, he was a park ranger. So the Fish and Wildlife Service, we always to explain it like the wildlife refuges for the animals and the parks are for people. So
Oh.
there's refuges all around the country for endangered species or whatever. So like in Texas, the refuge was set up for that endangered species, the whooping crane, that would migrate south and they would winter there on the refuge. So it literally, like it sounds, it was a refuge for the animals to
Hmm.
not be hunted or whatever. So just kind of a career ladder. Like I think the in Minnesota or North, we lived in North Dakota. I think the refuge was in Minnesota across the border, but he was like a wildlife biologist there. And then he kind of moved up the ranks and was an assistant manager at the Texas one, which was a pretty big refuge. And so then he kind of learned the chops. And then the Oklahoma move was so he could be a manager of a smaller refuge. And then kind of fortuitously, like his career was such that he realized he needed to sort of put some time in the quote unquote corporate or the regional center in New Mexico.
Hmm.
And he also knew like all, Texas and Oklahoma, where I basically went to grade school, was these tiny little towns of like K through 12 in one building. And I had like 12, third graders, and that was the whole class. So it was decent education, but I'm sure there was better opportunities. So it just worked out. Like by the time my older brother's 18 months older than me, and so by the time he was starting high school and I was in eighth grade, he thought it would be good to both for his career and for us to move to a bigger city to have better schooling. So it kind of worked out nice. Um, I continued my migratory ways. That's where I met you at Point Loma Nazarene College in San Diego.
Hmm.
Um, Finished there, and then I went to graduate school in Tucson. I got my PhD in cancer biology, and then moved to Denver to do my postdoctoral studies. And that's out of my childhood, so I guess I'll stop.
When did you kind of think that you wanted to get into the line of work that you're in? Was there always an interest in the research aspect of science, or was it the medicine, or what
Yeah.
was your launching point?
It's pretty defined actually. I mean, because my dad was a wildlife biologist and we grew up in nature, I kind of, and probably like everyone, you're kind of, what do you want to do when you grow up? Well, I want to be what my dad is.
Hmm.
So I kind of thought that, but really in high school, I had a really good chemistry teacher and I was pretty interested in chemistry and took a couple of like independent classes. Um, but then what really crystallized where I'm at now was because um, when you're a senior in high school, you can go visit that Point Loma college that I went to, and I pretty much knew that that's where I would want to go anyway. My parents, I was raised in the Church of the Nazarene, and there's a few Nazarene churches or colleges around the country, but of those, the Point Loma had kind of the better biology research. So even though I was like interested in chemistry, they also had good chemistry. So it was kind of a given looking back I would probably go there. So senior year, I went to visit, and I sat in on a genetics class that was just starting a new chapter, and it really just blew me away. I've always tried to remember. I don't feel like in high school that, like, if we talked about DNA and RNA and stuff like that, I really don't remember it. Like I said, I was pretty interested in chemistry, but Dr. Falk was the genetics professor that was teaching that day, and I still remember he talked. You can Wikipedia it, but it's called the lactose operon, and so lactose is just this sugar, and bacteria basically don't waste resources trying to digest the sugar if they don't, if the sugar's not around. So it was really pretty neat lecture about just, and it's very basic genetics, but just how the bacteria, if it senses that there's lactose around, it turns on genes because the lactose actually binds to these proteins, and sort of it turns it on and lets it digest the sugar that is now available. But just the way he described it, and all of that really was a turning point. So I ended up being a joint major of chemistry and biology, but really this biology and molecular biology and genetics was all kind of a spring point from that one genetics lecture I sat in on.
That's the one that just kind of sparked the interest, and the rest is, as they say, history.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. So now you're probably going to have to talk to me like I'm five. When you start talking about DNA and RNA and all that kind of stuff, my eyes start to glaze over. I'm just a fireman, so I really don't understand a lot of that stuff. But I don't think, see, we're both close to the same age, the big 50. And when we were younger, genetics or RNA or the stuff that they're doing now with, is it called CRISPR? Is that the
Hmm.
acronym?
Yep. Yep.
Was that even being looked at?
No.
Was that even on the radar at all?
No. Um,
Okay.
even when I was, yeah, learning all this stuff at Point Loma, let's just say in the early '90s,
Hmm.
um, that was still not really on the radar. It's pretty crazy how much things have, you know, just more than ballooned, like exponentially increased in knowledge over the last 30 years. Um, so no CRISPR and all that, like, back then, here's a way to gauge it. So like the guy that invented PCR, which nowadays, like, high school biology classes do this polymerase chain reaction to, basically it's kind of like a little Xerox machine to make more copies of DNA. Like that's as exciting as having a refrigerator in your house. Um, for scientists, but the guy got a Nobel Prize for it, like in the mid '90s or so, because was, before that, to make copies of DNA was very laborious and fraught with difficulty, and so that was in the '90s. So even being able to do the stuff that CRISPR does and chop out pieces of the genes and put it back together and all that stuff is definitely sort of the newer generation.
Is your industry, you always hear about, and when it comes to electronics, when you buy a laptop computer, 6 months later it's already obsolete, kind of a thing, as far as the speed and the processing power and all that. Is your industry similar to that, where now it's just snowballing to where it's accelerating so fast with discoveries and advancements that it's hard to kind of hold on. You're jumping onto a moving train, for lack of a better term.
Um, I mean, in some parts, yes, and some no. I mean, certainly it's more incremental than that. I mean,
Okay.
uh, there's even, from PCR to CRISPR was a slow going, but I think there's a pretty steady but even my point is unlike your computer, people are still using PCR. So, you build on it, but some foundational aspects are still there. Um, there's some pretty cool stuff now. Look, the kind of, I think that one of the new hot things is basically trying to do single cell stuff, which is really interesting when you before that, you basically take some tissue and grind it up and look at the DNA of the whole, chunk of tissue. And now they're trying to figure out, like, on a cell by cell level, what's the DNA and RNA expression and stuff. So you can get a really more, and the computing obviously helps.
Oh, sure.
You couldn't have done that before, but now you can get all this data from like every cell and get a much richer picture of what's happening, which is important because they're learning a lot about. They talk about like the tumor microenvironment, so just stuff right around the tumor. If you just chop off the whole tumor and try to sequence it, you miss a lot of the complexities that they're now realizing is there. So it's pretty cool. Like you're
Hmm.
just kind of seeing a window into stuff that you kind of knew something was going on, but now there's better tools in place to figure it out.
Now, the word you just used there was tumor. I don't know if we got to that point yet, but your area of specialty in your industry is you do essentially cancer research. Is that is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, I mean, um,
Is
it's
there a certain
more.
Go ahead.
Well, I used to do cancer research in that I was in the lab, like doing bench active stuff, and I
Okay.
still like that, but I'm more in the clinical side now. So I'm in a pharmaceutical company that runs clinical trials for cancer. So we have drugs, and we're trying to see if the drug works. So I mean, I guess technically it's still cancer research, but I'm not at the bench, doing cell stuff anymore,
Is
which I
there a
kind of miss.
certain is there a certain type of cancer that you prefer that your life's work has been spent on, a colon cancer or brain tumors or whatever?
Um, No, actually, and again, all the way back from Point Loma college days, I really got interested in cancer. Yeah, a lot of times when we're sort of introducing our group, the group I'm in, we kind of go around and say how we got where we're at, kind of like we're doing now. And I just feel really blessed. I mean, I haven't had a family member die of cancer,
Hmm.
particularly that unfortunately my wife's brother has, but I didn't know him all that well. But so my interest in cancer, in a way, was kind of academic, and that is specifically this idea of apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. And it's kind of there's a flip side of the coin. So Alzheimer's and neurodegeneration, basically there's too much cell death. The cells are killing themselves when they're not supposed to. And in cancer, some cancers can happen because they're not dying when they're supposed to. So
Hmm.
just so, and that's kind of across. I mean, obviously, there's some cancers that's more of an aspect of, but yeah, I my interest in cancer was more foundational. So it's not like I've always been interested in brain cancer or kidney
Hmm.
cancer or something like that. So it's kind of a foundational part of
Well,
it.
there is a benefit to that because, I mean, we all know somebody who's either dealt with cancer in some form or another, or they've unfortunately passed away, and that's an emotional aspect
Mhm.
of illness that some people deal with. But when you're able to just kind of look at the nuts and bolts of it and remove any emotion from it and really dig into it, I mean, that's probably freeing to a certain degree because you don't have any emotions getting in the way and it's just pure data, pure science, pure discovery.
Yes, I'm like the Mentat in Dune. I have no emotions.
uh,
No, but it is. I mean, when I hear other people talking about, how cancer had affected them personally or their
yeah,
family or something, I do feel blessed. But I
sure.
mean, it does. It is the cool side of being on the clinic, because you sometimes hear from patients, or run these clinical trials. You'll hear through the physician that's participating in the trial. They'll pass on, hey, our patient just had his tumor shrink by 30%, and they just want to thank you guys for the work you've done.
Oh,
So
that's
that's
really
pretty
got to
cool.
be nice.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
pretty neat.
I bet. Well, yeah, you're seeing the fruits of your labor, and it's you're not just cleaning something or whatever. You're helping people stay alive. So that's yeah, I can
Yeah,
see
it's
why that
pretty
would be
neat.
great. So to jump back just a tiny bit, you were in academia, and then you in Denver, and then
Mhm.
you moved. When did you leave the academic side of things and get into the, I guess, the corporate side of things, and talk us through that journey?
Yeah, it was uh, somewhat, I suppose you could say, pushed out of the nest or whatever. I think things are different now, which is probably for the best. But kind of in that time of the industry and academia and stuff, like I feel like there was more of a separation, and especially just when you're in graduate school, getting your PhD, and then usually the next sort of step is often that you're going to go do a postdoctoral research in another lab somewhere else and kind of learn how to write grants and do more independent research kind of under the wing of somebody, but you're supposed to sort of be learning to fly on your own. With again the idea basically like you're going to be a professor somewhere. And looking back, I realized my postdoc was probably atypical in some senses because I wanted to live in Denver, and so I looked at what was up there that I could, do my cancer apoptosis stuff with, and that's maybe a story for another time. But it was sort of serendipitous, and I enjoyed it, but I didn't have at that point. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to do this, and then I'll do this, and I'll be a professor, and then I'm going to go to industry or whatever. So I kind of backed into it, but uh, for my point is that I think back then there was a stronger wall between him and on the academia side. You always kind of hear like, well, if you really want the freedom to do the research you're interested in, you got to stay in academia. Industry, you're just like a drone, and you got to do what they tell you. And with that kind of propaganda, I'm like, well, I don't want to go to industry. But
Hmm.
I also saw that my professors were always writing grants and they're never in the lab. So I was like, well, what's what? So but ultimately, the professor I was doing my postdoc with moved her lab to Texas, and I didn't want to move. So I was like, well, and there's no other lab around here that's doing stuff, so let's see what's in industry. That was about a 2-year process to try to. Then it's always the chicken and the egg. All these places want you to have industry experience, and nobody will hire you to get the industry experience.
Uh,
But I think things have changed a little bit, so not to sound discouraging to people that are interested in this career path, because I think um, nowadays there's a lot more chances to intern and postdoc. That was the other thing. I feel like at the time I had heard things about like, well, if you go postdoc for industry, they won't hire you. And that's probably technically true. Like the place that you're actually postdocing, that lab that you're in and that manager, they probably have like rules in place that they can't just hire you from as a postdoc with a defined like 3-year time frame.
hmm.
But you get your foot in the door and certainly you could probably still get a job, and I've seen that happen when I was working at this other pharmaceutical that I moved over, that I got hired at eventually. So all that to say that I think people that are interested, you can really, and that's the other thing I was going to say is, I went ahead and got my PhD because I was just really interested in it and whatever. But there's certainly people that have gone far up the career ladder without a PhD. Like I think that science is still one of the places that it's sort of a true in ways a meritocracy. Like if you can do the work and publish good papers and whatever. Like I just remember at the company I was at, it was kind of a talking point that there's this lady who was running like I think almost all the diabetes programs or whatever, and she I think only had a bachelor's or something. And again, in industry, most people have a PhD that are kind of higher up in management. So and yeah, so you can get a bachelor's and go into industry and have a very lucrative career. You could get a master's and go into industry. So there's a lot of uh, routes into industry,
Hmm.
more so now than probably when I was starting.
I would imagine that the academic side of things is not near as lucrative as the corporate side or the industry side of things. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, yeah. I
Hmm.
don't know as much anymore, but I mean, in general, and so as far as I know, that's still the way things work. Is you're always having to write a grant to usually the government, or there's again in cancer, it's kind of quote unquote easier to get money, right? I'm going to cure cancer, so give me some money, as opposed to some niche. I want to study the bacteria that lives in sloths or something like that. So you
Right.
can but you're basically always having to write grants and ask for money and show how you're going to use that money, and then you've got 3 years to show something for that money that's been given to you. So it's definitely, I feel like I mean at some point the golden chalice for them is to get tenure as a professor, and then you, as I understand it, that's how ignorant I am, but as far as I understand it, like tenure, you get a salary, and you're not having to work as much on grants. But and I, for those that are on that track, forgive me if I'm misspeaking, but that's kind of what
Hmm.
I've always understood it to be. So
Sure.
yeah, I mean, at some point it probably. becomes lucrative, but it's certainly, I feel, a longer grind to get there.
Yeah. So your day-to-day job that you do now, you said that you're not doing much bench work anymore, and that I'm assuming that's you're not in the lab doing experiments for lack of a better term and
Yeah.
okay. You're in management now where you oversee people doing that kind of stuff and you're
Um,
is that fair or no?
no, not even that, unfortunately. Like the stuff I'm doing is with the clinical trials. So, I mean, I guess, I mean, I'm not really managing people. It's not like, hey, let's run this experiment and then show me what the cells did and let's
Mhm.
figure out the next step. I work in biomarker specifically for cancer trials. So we're trying, the whole point of biomarkers is just trying to get like an earlier read on things. So, you know, these phase one trials, the first time you put a drug in people, a cancer drug, you want to see, is it doing what we think it's going to do? Is it inhibiting this protein? Is it causing the immune cells to do what they're supposed to do?
Mm.
So you're not necessarily looking for everybody to be cured right away, unfortunately. But if it does, obviously that's the next step. But some of these early steps, you want to just see if there's sort of signals that would hint that the drug is working. So that's more what biomarkers do. So we we work with other companies that, their whole job is, they're called CROs, like contract research organizations. And so like I will specify, like, okay, let's draw blood at this time and this time and this time, and we're going to send it to this company, and they're going to look at the DNA from from tumor cells that are floating around in the blood, and we'll see if things have changed. So um, it's a lot of logistics and strategic planning and
Yeah.
scientific. We got to figure out what genes might be interesting and that kind of stuff. So it's still sciency, but it's not at the bench, and it's not even telling people what to do at the bench, but really working with, it's a pretty big team too for these clinical trials. So you're always talking to the medical people about the trial in general, and there are more logistics people that help you get the cells or the blood draws that you need and all that. So it's a it's a really big team.
The the clinical trial aspect of things, is there a general rule of thumb as far as it'll on average take 2, 3, 5 years or whatever to get to the point where you can actually give it to a human being for use, or does it depend on the drug or the type of cancer that you're dealing with?
Kind of yes to everything. I mean,
Okay.
there's a lot of, I think, again, the FDA is trying to help things go faster.
Hmm.
I would say, like, the shorthand everybody always says is probably maybe, I don't know, 5 to 10 years from start to finish. But there's ways, the FDA has what they call accelerated approval. So in certain, and I should just say, like, I've been in the industry for a while, but I've only more recently been on the clinical trial side of stuff. So I was at the bench for quite a bit longer. So I'm learning myself some of this stuff. So
Oh, okay.
take it with a grain of salt. But I mean, I know there's this, they call it accelerated approval, and there's certain parameters. Not everybody, you can't just always take your drug and try to get accelerated approval, but there's ways that you might get the FDA to agree that your drug could be sold quicker. And then you have to do, like, kind of these what do they call it, post marketing commitment, PMCs, like other trials. Like, the data looks good and you can start looking at things, but you have to promise to look at this and this and this also. Um, and then there's ways that, that you've probably heard, there's phase one, phase two, and phase three trials. So phase ones are the ones that I'm mainly doing, which is, again, like the very first time this chemical has ever been in a person, and you're just trying to see, does it do what we think it's doing? And phase two is more like, okay, it seems to work. We think we've picked a dose. Now we're going to try to see if it works, if it actually cures the people more so than what we saw in phase one. And phase three is kind of the big one that you always hear about, especially in, like, heart and, other than oncology, diabetes and heart disease, and those are the really big, expensive, make it or break it trials that take years sometimes to show a difference. So in a way, oncology is nice because it still takes a while, but it's pretty easy to see, like, okay, the tumor shrank and people are
Yeah.
living longer.
Right.
So I just remember, like, some diabetes trials on heart disease and stuff, like, literally would take like 10 years before they could publish their phase three results.
Mm.
So it's not that long for oncology anymore.
Yeah, it's frustrating. as an outsider looking in, you can appreciate the process that has to go through to make sure that it's safe, but it's also, when you're dealing with that, it almost seems like it's moving at a glacial pace and you'd wish it'd pick up a little bit, but you know,
Sorry. Yeah,
that's
one thing that's cool though is there is a big push too. I think in the industry, it's kind of mutually beneficial, but it's pretty surprising. We could go down a rabbit hole of what man on the street thinks about clinical trials, and there's I think a lot of people are uninformed about things and don't realize how many are out there.
Mhm.
And I mean, granted, it is an experimental drug, so you don't know if it's going to work or not. But I think there's been a push in the industry to try to educate people and realize, for instance, I think some people don't realize, like, a lot of these oncology clinical trials, it's not like you're not given a placebo, like, well, you get nothing or you get our drug. Like, you'll be getting what's the standard of care, like what everybody, if you just go to the hospital for your lung cancer, you're going to get treated with something. In the clinical trials, it's usually that something versus this drug, and so you're randomized to put either
Ah,
on this. So you get, a lot of the stuff is paid for. Like, it's not like you're. So there's things that I think people don't realize about clinical trials. Excuse me, and there's so many. And it helps us because a lot of times we're struggling to find patients to. That's why the trials take so long sometimes, is because we're only getting one patient a month. And
ah,
and by statistics, like, that's the whole point of phase three, is you need to have like a large number of patients so that you could do the statistics to show, like, okay, there is a meaningful difference between people treated with a standard of care and the people treated with our drug. And look, our drug is better, or at least our drug is the same, but you can't do that with like 50 people. You have to have like hundreds of people to do the geeky statistic stuff to prove, that there's a difference or an improvement.
is that number of people something that's set by the
Excuse me.
the government? Is that
No, no, there's a whole that's
industry
my
standard
son,
kind
my
of thing?
no, my son was even asking. I should have told him. I didn't even think about it. He asked me last night. He's like, "Dad, is there careers for like what you would like do math stuff?" And at first I drew a blank, but no, there's biostatistics people that their job is to like figure out how many patients you would need to. They call it a treatment effect. Is one thing they look at. Like, okay, if we enroll 600 patients, we would, or it's the other way around. They do all the math and they're like, okay, to see a 3% increase in survival over 6 months, we need to have 500 patients enrolled. Or, I don't even, like, it's black magic to me, but there's statistics people that are out there that's their job in industry, is to take all the parameters and figure out, like, how big does our trial need to be
Mhm.
able to, to say and have the math to prove that your drug is better or whatever.
To parlay that into a question, your industry seems like there's one giant umbrella of, pharmaceutical or cancer research or whatever you want to give the name, but there's a million different specialties and occupations that you probably could specialize in. Would that be fair
Oh
to say?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
What kind of person, I mean, I know I know you, so you're a very analytical person, but what types of people, as far as personality traits or skill sets, or just the natural way that some people are, who does well in your type of industry?
Well, I mean, it's excuse me, I'm sorry about that. There's all kind. I mean, at the core, I think a lot of. I mean, I was going to say almost everyone's a scientist, but that's not even true. I mean, there's people that, I mean, there's finance that's in these drug companies, so that you don't
Mhm.
not have to be a scientist to be in a drug company. But I think at the heart, there's people, yeah, want to solve problems. I think that's a general trait, is, problem solvers. Um, and just collaboration, especially like I just said, these clinical trials um, takes a lot of teamwork, a lot of different people doing different things, and communication is, because therefore it's important to let everybody know what's going on in your little part of it. Um, and so there's that, but there are more outspoken people. Yeah, so I wouldn't say like, oh, all the extroverts work in pharma or something like that. Like, I'm overall probably more introverted, but there's definitely extroverts. I mean, I think the main soft skill I would say is just collaboration and communication are the big things.
Mhm.
Um, because yeah, there's just for the clinical side, I would say especially. I mean, when you're at the bench doing stuff, you still have to communicate with people what you're doing and get feedback. And rarely do you have all the skill sets to do all the experiments you want to do. So you're always working with other people to do some aspect. Like you want to check this thing or that thing, and you don't have the equipment or you don't have the specialty. So you're and the more you collaborate, the more you get papers published, which is the big thing in academia is getting your science papers published, so people are always happy to work together.
Right.
Mm.
Your industry doesn't have the luxury of departments being siloed because you're all kind of moving in the same general direction. And so I can see communication being extremely important.
Yeah, and especially the thing I'm still, you know, butting heads with or just learning to live with it is these timelines. Like, because you work with the government, everything is very regulated, and that you need to have a meeting with the FDA. You work backwards on the clock all the time, so you're like, okay, well, if we want to, excuse me, meet with the FDA to talk about this, you look on their calendar like 6 months ahead of time. You're like, okay, well, if we're going to meet in March, we have to give them data by February so that they can digest it. And if they need the data by February, then we have to have all of our databases cleaned up by January. It's just like back, 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 back. So
Hmm.
even though like I'm still, my point is like I'll hear these quote unquote deadlines of okay, we got it. We're going to meet with the FDA in March. So I'm like, okay, well, it's November, got some time. But
Yeah.
no, actually, like some things have to be done at the end of November for this stuff to happen in March, and it's
Oh,
just crazy. Yeah. So like I'm not a planner as much, so things like that is something you got to get used to, and again, communication and stuff. So like now that I know, then I will make sure things are done in time. But
hmm.
it's really pretty crazy how detailed the planning is because again, all these different parts have to come together. So
It doesn't sound like it's a pressure cooker environment like the stock exchange or something working on Wall Street, but you also do have to uh, keep the ball moving as far as meeting the different benchmarks.
yeah, it's funny. I mean, I thought at first I thought you were being sarcastic because I
No, huh?
definitely it's
I'm never sarcastic, Brent.
I would s- I would say there's periods of manic activity and then periods of
Oh,
things are just going along. But
okay.
there can definitely be pressure, especially in these sort of regulatory environment when something's going to be submitted or you know that a critical trial time point is about to be reached or something. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen.
Hmm,
So there are definitely times when it's pretty crazy.
sure. Your industry, this question is going to be regional dependent. If you live in California, the cost of living is going to be higher, and so the wages would typically be higher than if you live in Iowa, for example. But is there, not talking about academia, but the industry, is there a general
Uh
expectation of pay on certain positions? Like when you're just getting started, what would you expect to look at pay wise?
oh. Yeah, it's really hard to throw a generic number out. If you're coming in with a bachelor's degree doing bench science stuff at
Hmm.
sort of an associate principal or whatever, I mean, even in Iowa, you're probably looking at easily. This is totally off the wall, but I'm
Yeah.
guessing 50 to 70K,
Okay.
and that I could be, but that I would say is the bare bones. I mean,
Sure.
it is, yeah. It really what experience you have, what education you have, yeah, where you're at,
Hmm.
and even for better or worse, like what disease area. I think sometimes maybe it was kind of whatever's hot, but like if the company you're in is really focused on diabetes, like maybe those people get paid a little bit more. I don't. It's hard to know. That's the other. I don't know how it is
Yeah.
in other companies or other industries, but it's not. There's. I think everybody. I think all the companies obviously try to be competitive, and so
Hmm.
It's not like company X pays way more than company Y.
I get it.
Like they probably are all around the same ballpark. And
Okay.
I have an N of two, so I've been in two sort of big pharmas, and they were comparable.
Yeah.
Um, so, but yeah,
Well, I'd
I
imagine
mean,
once you get your foot in the door, though, then you can certainly establish yourself and make a long term career out of it that would be financially rewarding. So
Yeah, yeah. But it's funny though. There's a lot of change. Industry has gone through different changes. So the company I started in, I was a little frustrated because it felt like literally about every 2 years there were reorgs, and I would get put in a different department with a different boss. Um, the company I'm in now, I feel is relatively stable. So some of it was just um,
yeah,
the time. But yeah, you can if you excuse me, if you do a good job and kind of, yeah, build your brand or whatever, people know that you're a good scientist, then
hmm,
yeah, it's either or. There's some people I've seen that will go from one company, especially if you are in like California or Boston's a big hot spot where there's a ton of like biotechs and stuff. People will jump from company to company. They'll learn something, go to another company, learn something else. So it depends. Like I mentioned earlier, like I probably am not as much of a planner as some people are. I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm not ambitious, but some people are very clear. I want to be leading
yeah.
a company or I want to be leading a group of 30 people doing this.
Hmm.
So they will leapfrog their way into that through different companies.
What you just mentioned there a minute ago about Boston being a hotspot, are there a number of areas? We live in the United States, so let's just stick with here. But where are the hot spots for your industry in the United States besides Boston? Is there, if
I
somebody was
mean,
wanting to look where they could live and make a living, is it close to them or if they'd have to move?
well, it's post COVID
Oh, yeah.
and and even I would say before that. I mean, obviously, New York City obviously has. It's funny, like there's not a lot of real estate per se. I mean, I guess post COVID, there's a lot of empty buildings now, but there's like a lot of, yeah. Now things are more decentralized, and so you can have people live wherever and work remotely. Especially if things like what I do. Like I'm not at the bench, so I don't have to um, go to a specialized lab and do certain things. If I have a laptop, I theoretically could work anywhere, I suppose.
Okay.
Um, so it kind of depends what you're doing. But I mean, in general, the coasts are where, and historically, right? So like the East Coast, Northeast, New Jersey is kind of a hotbed of big pharma,
Hmm.
just for historical reasons, probably. And then, of course, the Bay Area is another sort of hotbed of innovation in general, and there's biotechs out there. San
Hmm.
Diego is another one, of course. Those are kind of the ones you always hear about: San Diego, Boston, San Francisco, which
Okay.
unfortunately also are like super expensive. And I think
Sure.
that's why, again, post COVID, people on my team, even like there's some of us here in the Midwest, some of us are in New York. One of my colleagues is in Arizona. So the remote work is definitely a possibility as long as you're not physically at the bench. So,
Do you think the remote work is going to stick long term? I mean, we're pretty far past COVID now. I know some industries are wanting to get back to people coming into the office. Is your
yeah,
industry going to do that, or you think they'll stick with the remote?
yeah, I think maybe a hybrid.
Okay.
I think they've seen that remote can work, especially for, like I said, like these bioinformatic type things where you're not ever at the bench. And I think clinical trials, especially, have always been decentralized in the sense that, you don't need all these people in the same room all the time. Everybody's doing stuff, and with technology as it is now with Zoom and everything else. So um, I would think. I mean, I could see on the other hand, like people that live in the city that they are working in. That company may say, like, "Well, yeah, everybody's got to come in," but I don't know. It's been like you say, it's been a while post COVID, and it still
Yeah.
hasn't happened. So
Right. Well, if you weren't in your current career that you are right now, was there another occupation or line of work that always kind of interested you that, if I could go back and start all over again, I would do something completely different? I mean, obviously be a rock star or something, but maybe you want to be a plumber secretly or something like that.
yeah, I don't know. It's I the stuff like you've known me like hobby wise, like I like to snow ski and play ice hockey, but those were never. I actually started those later in life, so it's not like I grew up playing
Hmm.
hockey and I thought I would want to be an NHL player or something like that. So um, I don't know. I may be giving away your secrets, but I know we had a little bit of a pre-talk about what some of the subjects would be, so I knew you'd ask this question. I really
Hmm.
have been thinking about it. There's, if it wasn't this actual bench science, I will say, like, as you were alluding to, there's a lot of different things. So I think one thing that has changed that I wish I did more of is more of this computer aspect. There's like bioinformatics, and of course now with AI, there's just a lot. And as I mentioned, because there's computing power, it kind of goes hand in hand. There's more data that you can get from cellular research type stuff, and then you need people to be able to work with all that data. So, and even in what I do now, like I kind of wish I knew some more coding, even Python and R and some of these, which is probably even outdated in some respects. But I would say probably data adjacent or like science adjacent. I think I have always liked that kind of stuff, and yeah, there was never like a fork in the road, like
Hmm.
I could have done this, but I chose this or whatever. So,
Well,
but
everything I've known about you and then talking with you today, anybody listening can tell that you are very content with your line of work, and you still find it a challenge after doing it for what, how many decades now? So, uh, some people just find their passion and it happens to be their career and they take it and run with it. So, it's great to have people in something so important like cancer research that are actually happy in their job and they still find it a challenge and they still find um, satisfaction out of it. So,
yeah, yeah, it's I mean, there's things change enough that it's always
sure.
there's always more to learn.
Yeah. Have you ever gotten, what's the best compliment that you've ever received from somebody? It doesn't have to be at work. It could be, a mentor or,
Um, yeah, I think I did think more work specific.
Mhm.
It's maybe even a, I don't know. I just thought it was an indirect compliment, I guess, in the sense that I was kind of proud of it secretly, I guess. But trying to remember when I was in grad school. Basically, in grad school, you take classes for the first couple of years, and you're doing some research for your professor, and then the last couple of years, you're really done with classes, and you're basically being a scientist, learning stuff at the bench and whatever. But those first couple of years, it's kind of like college again. I mean, but it's like halftime, so you're definitely hard at work learning stuff, but then you still do stuff in the lab.
Mm,
But I remember towards the end of my grad school, so, and kind of like college, they don't really say freshman, sophomore, junior, senior or something, but you're in grad school for 4 to 5 years, and you get to know in these smaller programs like I was in, you get to know the younger students, but not overly well sometimes because by then you're kind of stuck in the lab and they're the ones going to classes. All that to say, I felt secretly a little bit proud. Somehow I was talking to one of the younger ones, and they take the same courses that I took, and one of them pulled out like a Xerox of my test answers, like because most of these you're having to write these like big essays about how would you solve this genetic problem or something. I don't remember what it
mhm,
was, but I was like, wait a minute, that's mine. Why are you guys studying off of mine? And they're like, because I did get pretty good grades and stuff, and my handwriting was atrocious. This was way before laptops and stuff, and so they were still xeroxing my uh, answers and using them to help study. So I felt that was kind of cool.
well, yeah, they know they're gonna do well if they follow your examples. So,
But,
good deal. Is there somebody? I mean, you mentioned early on one of your professors that was kind of a, I don't know, a mentor or somebody that just kind of launched your interest and it just kind of sparked your interest in your career. Is there somebody else that you admire, somebody in your field or somebody outside of where you work that you just like to follow their stuff and
um, well, it's funny. I kind of sounds like jumping on the bandwagon, but just more recently, like just with, I'm actually not on Twitter, but Elon Musk, he seems to be sort of the Isaac Newton of our time or something. It's
yeah,
kind of crazy that this one guy can be successful at such disparate things, but
yeah,
um, just this idea, especially I've only read like sort of third hand. I haven't read his biographies or anything like that, but just the drive that he has and this whole, it seems like he really wants to go to Mars and to take a step back and uh, I just think it's a neat time to be alive, and so I again, you and I are same age. We were born, let's just say, in the '80s or before. And if you look back, people that were born in the 1880s and live, until like the 1950s, even, like, think how much life changed from like basically the old West,
Oh yeah.
1880s, to World War I,
Hmm.
World War II, all that stuff. And I feel like we're kind of like that today. Like, how much things have changed since we were a kid,
Yeah.
and now there's this guy that in my lifetime, theoretically, maybe we're going to go to another planet. And this guy seems to be single-handedly, I wouldn't say responsible for it, but like he's the one that's really pushing this along. And so I think there's a lot to admire with him. Again, I don't know him as a person or other
Yeah.
stuff, but just recently he's been on my radar as like somebody that's pretty crazy to know
He is
about.
having his moment. He seems to
Yeah,
be everywhere, and some of that's political, but some of it is just he's got so many industries, and he's just a big dreamer, a big thinker, and he just goes for it with everything he's got. Of course, he has the finances to make a lot of that happen, but
yeah,
yeah, it's crazy to think that, if we live another 20, 30, 40 years, we could see human beings on Mars. I mean, that's just insane to think about. So,
yeah.
yeah. Well, Brent, thanks. I've known you for a long time, and I even learned a lot about you today by talking with you. You've got a pretty cool story, and it's always neat to see the inner workings of someone's progress, from where their occupation and their interest starts all the way to where they are now. And you've been successful at what you do. Hopefully, I never get cancer, but if I do, I've got your cell phone number, so I'll give you a call.
Yeah, thanks. No, this has been fun. I hope somebody
Yeah,
can help benefit from it, and
yeah,
I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. I think it's cool to let people know all the massive varieties of jobs that are out there and
yeah.
how people get there.
Thanks, man. I appreciate your help.
All right, it's good talking to you as always.
You bet. Thanks, Brent.
Yep, take it easy.
And with that, we will wrap up yet another successful episode of the Jobs Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. As always, I wait till the end of an interview to ask for likes, subscriptions, and shares. I want to make sure that you liked what you heard, you feel it's worth subscribing and sharing with everybody that you know. So we will see you on the next one. Have a good day.